Now, under certain conditions, fat cells in the body release particular types of fatty acids which are stored in the liver. And that is steatosis, or fatty changes in the liver. But these fatty acids are toxic to certain tissues, including heart muscle. Extremely important issue. So I've got to go back home now and spend months researching it and asking questions about it, because it could be a very important issue. It has to be important. Since 1957, I've been wondering what in the hell steatosis of the liver is all about. I've looked it up on the internet, I've asked specialists, I've asked biochemists, I've asked all sorts of people. They say it doesn't mean much. But why did I only find it in these kids that died and not in anybody else? So now I know that these fatty acids are toxic to heart muscle. So God knows what else they do. So I'm one step ahead now after all these years, and I find that very exciting.
You're excited about everything. Hang on one second. Am I seeing my... I think you finished this thought about pollen. Okay.
I agree with you.
Right, there was something there, but that's okay. Well, it may come.
Did I miss it?
I don't know if it was the serendipity of finding, well, you said Colin was, you thought of him as a god, and then maybe it was the serendipity of finding this article of all places all of a sudden here.
Well, he finished the thought about...
1957, and I've been worried about, or concerned about, the real significance of steatosis, and have been totally and utterly frustrated when I approached various authorities on it. And here at last I read it in a technical magazine. And as I said, it means that I've got a lot more work to do. But I'm one step further ahead. And this has got to prove to be extremely valuable. And it only happened yesterday. Now I think I can say quite honestly that that sort of thing has happened to me often, and at the very times when I desperately needed to know what the mechanisms involved were. Not just with my work in medicine, but when I became almost obsessed with the beauty and the magnificence and the strangeness of Australian precious opal. And I was trying to figure out, why do we get these changes in colour? And I'd go to bed at night thinking about it. I'd wake up early in the morning, I had it like that. It's not because I'm particularly brilliant, because I know I'm not particularly brilliant. It is just because I bothered to think deeply and long.
Hang on one second.
Yeah, is that going to be in?
Does she still have those flip-flops on?
I don't
If
know.
she comes in with those flip-flops on.
But we're
If you could repeat that about, it's sort of like you were ready when the thought came to you. If you could repeat that part about, well, you say you've been lucky, but it's not really lucky. You've prepared yourself for those moments to be, for those eureka moments.
Yes, I think you could say that I was lucky, but it's happened too often for me to even think that it was just luck. A lot of it was due to the fact that I thought and thought and thought very carefully and for long, thought deeply about it. And although you may not agree with me, I really think that I often got a bit of help from the guy upstairs. And the guy upstairs seems to know things that I don't know. Because at Cooper Pedy, for example, if I'd continued as an opal miner, I would have been rich. I would never have gone back to medicine, never. But he created a situation where I had no choice. I had to go back. And I went back willingly in the finish, of course. But every time I've tried to deviate from the way that the guy upstairs really wants me to go, I've been pulled back kicking and screaming all the way. You see, if that particular miner who wanted me to have his claim, he's going to give me that claim in Cooper Pedy, I would have been one of the richest Greeks in Australia. Never have gone into medicine. So I don't really know. I think I've been, you might call it, blessed in many ways. The only problem is there's a hell of a lot of problems still ahead of me. I'm obviously not going to solve them all. A lot of problems that we've been able to solve, I've simply have been answered because of the people that I mix with. You've already mentioned Glenn Detman, for example. And I could think of many people. I've talked about Dr. Harbison, who first put me onto scurvy. I could think of Dr. Robert Reisinger in America here, the veterinarian who first alerted me to the existence of endotoxin. So all these people have played very important roles, and they deserve as much credit as anything that I will ever receive. But I have been fortunate in that I've been able to connect all these things together.
Is Doug Harbison still alive?
Yes.
Maybe we get to talk to him sometime.
While we're on people, tell us a little bit more about Glenn. He was a real fighter too, wasn't he? I mean, in terms of going up against the establishment.
He certainly was. He would never take no for an answer. But he would investigate and investigate deeply. He had enormous experience as a microbiologist. He knew how to use a microscope. He knew all about germs and so forth. So that he was able to work things out in a way that I could never have succeeded. I think, I'm quite certain if I didn't have him to help me, that I'd very much doubt if we would have ever got anywhere. And now I have the pleasure of working with his son, who has a PhD in biochemistry from Monash University, and we work very close together. And I don't know what I would do without him. I ring him up nearly every day, and we discuss biochemistry and some of the complex issues, and we work very well together.
Well,
Yeah, we'll have to go film him, I think.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Boy, if you don't mind, y'all just tell me if I'm getting too far afield here, but I just feel that there's a lot of these things that are kind of scientific terms that we or the audience needs to have a understanding of. And so you don't have to go into a lot of detail on this, but just some of these things we've already, endotoxins, I think we already have a good understanding of. Just if you could describe scurvy, just tell us what scurvy is and why you think the role of vitamin C in terms of scurvy is.
Acute infantile scurvy.
Yeah.
Well, scurvy, particularly infantile scurvy, is a dirty word. Can't think of a better way to describe it. Because it is not a specific disease. It is not just a deficiency of vitamin C. A simple way to describe that is to think. You have an experimental animal, you make sure that it doesn't get any vitamin C in its diet, and it gets sick and it dies, and you examine its tissues. And doctors have always said that what they find in that animal after death is scurvy. But the fact is, long before death occurs, the deficiency of vitamin C interferes with a whole host of things that become involved. And the end product is not just a deficiency of vitamin C. When it comes to the coexistence of endotoxin, for example, endotoxin has some of the same sort of effects as actually vitamin C deficiency has on the bones and the connective tissue. So the end result really is not just scurvy, it is endotoxemia too. And then the authorities will tell you that infantile scurvy doesn't occur until after the age of 6 months. Now that was largely the case years ago, before the introduction of antibiotics, vaccines, pollution of the environment, and the growing of food under less than ideal conditions. Failure to breastfeed and also cigarette smoking. So now, what is called scurvy can occur at a much earlier date. In fact, in experimental animals, you can get scurvy in the fetus before it is born. So this whole concept of classical scurvy as described by the original authors 60 years ago or so doesn't really apply. And many of my colleagues, including Dr. Ian Detman, would prefer never to use the word scurvy. But it's ingrained, and we more or less have to use it. So I repeat, it's not really just a deficiency of vitamin C. A whole lot of other factors come into it all along the line.
And so it seems like I, as a layman, and perhaps this is something that has to be understood by people in the film, is it, I can't really draw the lines between scurvy and shaken baby syndrome and SIDS. I mean, they all seem to have kind of the same, be similar. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, they have common roots. In SIDS, it's usually endotoxin, which finds its way through the brain, the blood-brain barrier, into the respiratory centre of the brain, and stops the respiratory centre from working, either permanently or temporarily. And that has to be the mechanism in most cases of SIDS. I can't prove it beyond any doubt, but it's the only thing that fits. And it's the only thing that fits because otherwise, why does vitamin C have such a dramatic effect? As proven by that doctor in Mexico that I spoke about this morning. It can't really be anything else. Admittedly, the biochemical pathways involved might be quite complex. I'm sure they are. but the effect is extremely rapid and dramatic. So whether it's the direct effect of the endotoxin or whether it's the effect of what they call mediators that are initiated by endotoxin, because the endotoxin might set in train one series of events which leads to more events and so on. They call that a cascade. But you may as well say that it's really the endotoxin that does it. And I should also stress that although I talk a lot about endotoxin, any bacterial toxin, apart from endotoxin, can have the same effect. So that is SIDS. Except, no, there's one further thing. One Australian researcher went to the trouble to investigate SIDS cases, and he found two important things. First, that a very high proportion of them had toxic strains of bacteria in their gut. A very significant number. And those are the ones that produce a lot of endotoxin. Secondly, he found in the blood very high amounts of a fibrin degradation product called D-dimer. In other words, there's a severe coagulation disorder in these infants, and that is why sometimes you do find hemorrhages a bit in some cases that are considered to be SIDS. But these figures were extremely high. The normal figure for a D-dimer, I can't remember exactly, might say be 10 or 20. He found levels in SID cases of well over 1,000. Whereas in infants that died in road accidents, he found normal levels. And most laboratories don't go to the end point with D-dimer. They say more than 20 or more than 40 or whatever. So they rarely get a true indication of what it is. So all this is very strong evidence indeed that at least in the majority of cases of SIDS, endotoxin plays a role. And then of course you can go back and think, well, what causes all the endotoxin to be let loose? And that involves infections and antibiotics and failure to properly breastfeed and a whole lot of things, of course. And they all play important roles. But the end result is endotoxin. So that's one pathway, and it ends up in a SIDS death. But sometimes things are a bit slower, and the respiratory centre is not affected so dramatically. And endotoxin can seep through into the brain. You can get brain swelling. You can get brain hemorrhages. You can get hemorrhages in any part of the body because the endotoxin, together with an increased utilisation of vitamin C, causes severe disturbances in the way that the blood clots. At the same time, so that's why you get hemorrhages in the retinas, in the brain, in the membrane surrounding the brain, sometimes hemorrhages elsewhere. And you get all sorts of other disturbances too, which are sometimes found. At the same time, the endotoxin, together with the increased utilisation of vitamin C, affects the growing portions of some bones. But it doesn't affect every bone equally at once. It might start in one bone and next week it might appear in another bone and so forth. And when you x-ray these babies, it looks as if they've been traumatised on more than one occasion because they look like fractures that are at different ages. All this can be demonstrated quite clearly. Each step can be demonstrated from knowledge that we have that is available in the medical literature, and I mean the real medical literature, not in the Sunday papers, and there's masses of it. In fact, there's too much of it. And that's obviously the mechanism. And in the 40 or more cases of shaken babies that I have investigated, there are real reasons to know that endotoxin is involved. Despite the fact that very often in a court report, prosecutors will say a previously well baby, it's a heap of rubbish. These babies are never really well. Most of them are sick from day one. Had multiple doses of antibiotics. They've had all sorts of illnesses. And the final insult very often is the administration of vaccines. So it is all there. There cannot be any other explanation. Certainly we don't know everything. If I come back in 1,000 years' time, there'll be a whole lot more knowledge for me to look at. But we know enough. It just has to be. Can't be any way. It has to be that way. And finally, I must say that it's important to keep an open mind because I realise that it is possible to shake a baby to death. But I've yet to see one. I think those statistics of 40 or more cases where I can explain the pathologies that were found in a way that doesn't involve inflicted injuries is tremendously important.
Would you like some more?
No, I'm right, thank you.
Okay, why in the world will it just seems like such an easy test to run to find out if injections of vitamin C will save babies' lives or not. Why are they just absolutely so opposed to just doing what would, be a very simple experiment to prove this right or wrong?
A lot of doctors believe that such doses of vitamin C will kill a child. That's absolute rubbish. I've given huge doses to infants and to adults by injection. No problems at all. They are indoctrinated, a lot of doctors. They don't understand. They don't understand the mechanisms. You can look, for example, at the role that vitamin C could play in the treatment and to a certain extent the prevention of exposure to atomic radiation. Now, atomic radiation is really not that much different to the radiation that is given to patients with cancer. They have radiotherapy. It's the same thing. And I have treated, I wouldn't know how many patients that have been on or receiving radiation treatment for cancer. There's heaps of doctors throughout the world that have given intravenous vitamin C for patients that are having radiation treatment for cancer. The literature is quite plain. Because the only literature that appears to prove that vitamin C doesn't work or is dangerous is obviously faulty. Clearly faulty and hasn't stood the test of time. What has stood the test of time is that vitamin C, when given, say, the treatment of cancer, either alone or in conjunction with radiotherapy or chemotherapy, has a very clear and distinct anti-cancer effect. It in no ways reduces the beneficial effects of chemotherapy or radiation. In fact, it aids the anti-cancer effect. And that is quite clear, and I wouldn't dare say this in public if I couldn't prove it, because the authorities could jump on me and wipe me off the face of the earth. I was going to say my opinion, but there is no doubt whatsoever that it's cruel not to give intravenous vitamin C to such patients. One of the first patients I treated was riddled with cancer. He was told to go home, write out his will and lie down. He came to me. They gave him chemotherapy. He came to me and I started him off on treatment with vitamin C and so on. He did extraordinarily well. Normally with such treatment a patient's hair would fall out, they'd get terribly sick and so forth. Nothing like that happened. And the doctors at the big hospital couldn't understand why. So they had a special meeting and sat him down in the middle of the meeting and offered various opinions as to why he hadn't got severe reactions. And after a while he thought, well, I better tell them. He said, I went and saw Archie Kalokerinos. Well, their action, he told me later, was dramatic. All the doctors got up and walked out. Now that happened about 25 years ago. That man today is entirely free from cancer. If you come to Australia, I'll try to get you to see him. Now it's easy for me, of course, to speak of successes, and for every success I could list a great number of failures. But the fact is that the average person who goes on vitamin C and other antioxidants as a supplementary form of treatment for cancer lives longer, suffers less, and dies in a much better way. So why not use it? It's easy. But doctors are, oncologists in particular, and other doctors are totally opposed to it, more often than not. Some are accepting it, and some major hospitals in the United States here are using vitamin C as supplementary forms of treatment for various cancers. I'll give you another example which is very personal and disturbs me greatly. My late brother James, who was a radiologist, was my right hand. He's a great supporter and he's a brilliant diagnostician. He got sick and was suffering from a rare form of arterial disease from which he was soon to die. And he noticed that breathlessness was a problem. And he found that the only thing that gave him relief from the breathlessness was morphine. So I came down to see him, and he was terribly ill. My mother hadn't been told that he was so ill, and although I tried to soften the blow when I took her to see him, it must have been a terrible shock to her. And while we were standing by my brother's bedside, it was all he could do to turn to the senior registrar who had just walked in and ask for another injection of morphine. And this girl snapped at him and said, "No, you've already had enough," and turned on her heels and started to walk out. My mother hadn't have been there, I would have grabbed that girl and thrown her on the floor and put my boot on her throat. He's going to be dead in a few days. Who in hell cared how much morphine he had? But I happen to know, I just happen to have known a lot about reasons for breathlessness. And I should explain this because it's an important issue. I was faced with the problem of dealing with very violent, drunken Aboriginal men. and many times I was physically assaulted badly. The problem was that to sedate them to an extent where they were controllable was highly dangerous. And although I never actually lost any patients, I had a few close shaves, and a lot of other doctors did lose a lot of patients. Now, I had observed with sick kids that were irritable and cross and so forth, and couldn't be consoled. If I gave them an injection of vitamin C, that very often they quickly became calm, cool and collected. So I thought, it was just a thought, and I was desperate. I thought, well, if an injection of vitamin C calms these kids, I wonder what an injection of vitamin C would do to these alcoholics. So being a Greek, I mixed up a very rich mixture indeed of vitamin C. I got a great big needle, in it went, bang, straight up the vein. Within seconds, the patient became unconscious. So I stopped the infusion. But the state of unconsciousness resembled exactly an overdose of morphine, with the pinpoint pupils, everything exactly like an overdose of morphine. Well, I knew straight away that I was onto something really red hot. This was an incredible observation. I found if I sped the infusion up, they'd go back into this morphine-like state. If I stopped it, they would recover very quickly, but if I gave the infusion at a moderate rate, I got rapid detoxification and calming. Now, I couldn't explain this action. I wrote a letter which I sent to every major medical journal in the world with one short sentence describing the observation, another short sentence asking if anyone else had experienced it, and the final sentence asking if anyone could explain it. None of them would publish it. I was at a conference in America here. During a coffee break, I heard a very English voice speaking across this crowded room. And a few words were said. My ears pricked up, and I walked across and I interrupted the conversation. I found that I was speaking to the late Professor, what's wrong with me? My mind's gone blank. David Horrobin. And I told him about my observation. He said that he'd been trying to find a doctor who experienced it because he forecast on theoretical grounds that it must happen. And he gave me what he considered to be an explanation. And whichever way you look at it, it was obvious that the reason why morphine works on the body is not because nature deliberately manufactured the morphine receptor sites in the brain to take morphine. That wasn't her idea. Those receptor sites are there to accept morphine-like substances called endorphins that we produce in our body ourselves. It keeps us cool, calm and collected. And it just so happens that the key that fits the lock matches exactly the key that morphine has in its structure. So at least I had some sort of understanding. Now, at the same time, I read in a medical journal that some children and adults with severe asthma who fail to respond to standard treatments and whose blood gases were not severely disturbed, in other words, the levels of oxygen in their blood was reasonable, found that morphine gave them relief from the breathlessness. And that was an important thing that I read in the journal. I still don't know how I come to read it, but I did. So it was very, very obvious that what I was doing with the vitamin C had some effect on the morphine receptor sites, and I got a reaction as if it was morphine. And if morphine relieved the breathlessness when the blood gases were fairly normal in asthmatics, then there was something very important going on. Now my brother had found that he was getting more and more breathless the whole time. And he found that morphine was the only thing that gave him relief. And that's why he kept asking for more and more morphine, because pain is one thing that many people can learn to tolerate to a large degree, but being breathless, that is intolerable. Well, I tried to point out to the doctors who were in charge of my brother's case that I knew a bit about this, and if they would give my brother an intravenous infusion, a continuous intravenous infusion of vitamin C, that he wouldn't need any of the morphine, and his last few days of life on this earth would be far more pleasant. They wouldn't have it. They told me that his blood gases were were abnormal. I had a quick look at my brother's x-rays and I couldn't see anything in the lungs that suggested that he should be so breathless. So Jim died. At his funeral I was approached by a personal friend of Jim's, a professor of medicine, a man who I admire greatly. I went through university with him. And he said to me, it's the funny thing about Jim. Although he was so breathless, his blood gases were normal. Well, that really made my blood boil. I'm not talking about him because this particular professor, he didn't have clinical responsibility for Jim. He was just a visitor. But those bastards knew all the time that my brother's blood gases were normal, but they were telling me that his breathlessness was due to fibrosis in his lungs, when it wasn't. Something that I'll never forgive them for. I'll never forgive them, first of all, because they expanded my brother's suffering, and secondly because if they'd only have listened, they would have been on the pathway to understanding a whole lot of other things that would benefit many, many more patients later on.